Good afternoon to all of you. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Michel Ganado. First of all, I hope that you're all well and getting to grips with sort of this surreal situation that we are living in at the moment. I guess if there's one thing that this COVID crisis is highlighting as each day goes by is the notion that our reality of 4 weeks ago is not necessarily the one that we're going to be facing in the weeks and months ahead. And in the context of this unknown, therefore, businesses need to survive, and in the process need to consider how to strategize and innovate. And the purpose of today's webinar, therefore, is to give you an update of the different grants and schemes that are available to businesses. Before I move on to sort of introduce a bit further today's proceedings, maybe I'd like to focus a bit on a bit of housekeeping for the purposes of this webinar. So if we could kindly ask each of you to mute your microphones and switch off camera for the purposes of ensuring better sort of experience in terms of ensuring that there aren't sort of no sort of outages on the broadcast. I think it's also important to mention that we are recording this particular webinar, so just to be aware that sort of this webinar is being recorded, but at the same time would kindly ask that sort of there's no unauthorized recording of this webinar taking place from your end. What we'll also be doing at the end of this particular session, we'll be organizing a question and answer session. However, you will notice that at the towards the top right hand end of the screen, there is a particular icon where you can be, sort of putting in any particular sort of questions that you might have, and we'll be taking note of them and picking them up at the end. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of the sort of speakers for today, besides myself, there'll be David and Maria. There's going to be Angelique from our advisory practice together with Daniela, and there'll be Andrew Abela also from our PwC Academy. If we were to look a bit at the agenda, Carl, if you can move on. So we'll be covering quite a number of areas. Starting off by giving you a bit of an overview on the EU SME grant schemes that there are available at this point in time. Obviously, where we feel that they are relevant to these particular sort of, given the current situation and how sort of they could be leveraged for businesses accordingly. We'll then move on and talk a bit about what schemes are available at Malta Enterprise. We'll also be giving you a bit of an update in terms of the latest developments at the Malta Development Bank guarantee scheme, and this will be picked up by Angelique Spina. And last but not least, then we'll hand over a bit to Andrew Abela, who will also be giving a bit of guidance in terms of what training schemes there are available that you might wish to avail yourselves of at this particular point in time. And as I indicated before, we'll have a QA session. Just again, in terms of guidelines, we're looking at sort of having a bit around 45-minute presentation, and then sort of we can wrap up the session with any questions that you might have. So at this point in time, I'll hand over to Daniela Burlo to take you through what are available from the SME grant schemes.
Thank you, Michel. So the idea of this part of the session is to take you through the SME grant schemes that are facilitated through EU funding. As Michel mentioned, these are the schemes that could be of particular relevance at this point in time, given the current pressures that companies may be facing. Just something to note up front is that these are schemes that are only available to SMEs. So we will also be looking at what defines SME and the different thresholds that one would need to fall under to qualify for these schemes. So starting off with the different thresholds, as you can see on the slide, what we need to be looking at here is the staff headcount, okay, the annual turnover or the balance sheet total. So in terms of the employee headcount, we must always satisfy this criteria, and it must be under the 250 full-time equivalents. This includes both full-timers and part-timers, as well as any seasonal and temporary staff. Following that, then we will need to look at either the annual turnover or the balance sheet total. So in this case, sort of the maximum threshold that you need to be meeting is that the annual turnover falls below the 50 million threshold, or the balance sheet total is below the 43 million threshold. As you can see in the table here, we've got the different categories for micro, small, and medium. However, for the purposes of these EU grant schemes that we will be explaining, irrespective of whether one falls as a micro, small, or medium, the amount of aid and relevance of this scheme will apply across. Okay, so that is just a point to keep in mind. Now, in determining whether one falls within these thresholds, the information that we need to refer to are the latest approved annual accounts. Okay, and should a company be in its infancy and still not have financial statements, bona fide estimates would need to be prepared in this case following the preparation of a business plan. Okay, so it is important that anyone availing from these schemes falls within these thresholds. Now we'll move on to the three main EU grant schemes that are of particular relevance at this time. So starting off with the Consultancy Services Grant Scheme, this scheme is available to aid enterprises in preparing various studies. Okay, so under this scheme, you can receive aid for the preparation of business plans, business recovery plans, which seem to be a bit more popular now, given the current situation, feasibility studies, organization and operations reviews, and process reviews. In this case, the way that it works is that the entity that is interested in this scheme would need to submit an online application, okay, to the managing authority. The scheme will be, the application will be assessed, and if applicable, will be approved. And then that particular entity will receive a lump sum grant of 4,000 euros to commission a registered external consultancy service provider to be able to help them out in preparing these studies. It is important that work on the studies do not commence until the grant is approved. Now, in terms of cutoff dates, the managing authority is trying to quicken the process, and they have introduced cutoff dates every fortnight, okay, commencing from the 17th of April to the 30th of June. This means that one can submit their application by that date, and there is roughly a 1 to 2 week period for evaluation. Okay, so that is the Consultancy Services Grant Scheme. We will move on to the e-commerce grant scheme. So a second scheme, which is quite popular at this time, is the e-commerce grant scheme, which facilitates basically the design, development, and implementation of an e-commerce website. What is important under this scheme is that the website includes an online payment gateway. So this means that it would need to allow any online sales and booking to take place through the website. The costs that would be eligible under this scheme are the domain name registration and any hosting fees, the content management system software and any required licenses, the development of the website or mobile application designed to the brand identity of the entity in question, the integration of a shopping cart and any other setup fees. Now, unlike the Consultancy Grant Scheme where you have a lump sum of €4,000, in the case of this scheme, one can receive part financing of 50% of these eligible costs, which are in the grey box, and these are capped to €5,000. Okay, now in the same way that the Consultancy Grant Scheme is working, the managing authority has introduced cut-off dates every fortnight, again commencing from the 17th of April to the 30th of June. So these applications will be evaluated every 2 weeks. So the next scheme is the Diversification and Innovation Grant Scheme. We're also mentioning this scheme because it might be the case that entities feel that perhaps the current line of service they are in might sort of be suffering, so they could be interested in addressing their market challenges by entering into different areas. So the actions that would be eligible under the scheme are the diversification of the output of the existing establishment into products and services that aren't currently produced by the entity. Okay, so currently you might be producing this particular product or delivering this service, but you may want to divert your services into other areas that still fall within the same NACE code. The second action here is a completely new economic activity related to the diversification of the activity of the establishment. The third eligible action is the acquisition and integration of solutions that are new or significantly advanced than those that are currently in use. So you might want to upgrade your systems. And the fourth one is also similar. So here you might have a fundamental change to your production process. And here we have the adoption of solutions that lead to the development of significantly improved product services. So here, these are the actions that would qualify under this scheme. And here, one would receive 50% of the eligible costs with the grant capped at 200,000. In this case, the cost that would be eligible would be the lease and rental of premises, construction and upgrade of any premises, patents and licenses, equipment and machinery, wages of a change manager. It is important to note that for the costs relating to rental, construction, and patents and licenses, there the capping is 10% of the eligible cost. The rest would be towards the equipment component and the wages. Now, in the case of this scheme, unlike the other two schemes, the cutoff dates are at the end of each month, okay, running from 30th April till the 30th of June. So that wraps up the EU SME grant schemes, and I'll just close off with a generic slide on the entities and the different sectors that would be excluded from applying for these schemes. So apart from not qualifying as an SME, these undertakings will also be excluded from applying for these three schemes. Okay, so here you have any undertakings that are subject to outstanding recovery orders by the Commission. Undertakings that are currently in collective insolvency proceedings, activities which fall under agriculture, forestry, and fishery, because there is a separate scheme for those, undertakings that are in the operation of manufacturing, processing, and marketing of tobacco and tobacco products, public entities, which also have a separate set of schemes, energy generation, distribution, and infrastructure, the steel, coal, shipbuilding, transport, and synthetic fiber sectors, and the financial, insurance, real estate, betting, and gambling activities. Okay, so that wraps up the SME grant schemes. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat box. I will now pass on to David Ferry to introduce the Malta Enterprise Schemes.
Hi, thanks Daniela. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, Maria will go through the schemes currently in place. I must say that we have been inundated with calls and also have had to do quite a number of follow-ups in terms of the contents of the aid and the schemes that are currently in operation. And my suggestion is that whatever you hear from this webinar, please watch the space, because there are still a number of uncertainties, as Maria probably will point out as well in her presentation, and things are developing maybe not every hour now, but every day, you come across new circumstances, new cases which are not very well covered by the regulations, and which even we would have to actually reach out to Malta Enterprise, the revenue, or the relevant authorities to actually understand how one should be treating that situation in the particular circumstances. But I don't want to take too much time of this, and I will leave it to Maria to take it on from here. Maria?
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. The first point I wish to make in terms of all the schemes I will be discussing is that these are applicable for both large undertakings and SMEs. So this is different to what Daniela was explaining in terms of EU grants. So the wage supplement measure, I'm sure that this is the most popular scheme and probably does not need any introduction. As you are aware, this provides employers with a supplement to cover part of their employees' basic wage. What is the amount that a company can avail of under this supplement? And as you may be aware, Malta Enterprise has drafted 2 lists. The first one includes those industries that are considered to be critically hit by this pandemic. And the second list includes those undertakings, those industries, which are considered to be adversely hit. So in the first list, you can see companies that are engaged in the hotel sector, in food and beverage, personal service activities, etc. In the second list, you will see companies which are engaged in manufacturing activities, warehousing, advertising, etc. One question which we have been facing is, what if my entity is not included in either list? First of all, the list makes reference to the NACE code of a company, so an industrial classification which represents the activities of the company. If a company's NACE is not included in either of the lists, we have discussed this with Malta Enterprise, and companies may still apply under the scheme and make their case through the application form. Also, in the case of entities which possibly fall under Annex B, however, they feel that their business has been severely hit by this crisis, also through the application, the company may make this case that it considers itself to be considered as a company falling under Annex A and B. Naturally, in these cases, Malta Enterprise may request further information to substantiate the case. So, what is the difference between falling under Annex A or under Annex B? Primarily relates to the amount of aid that can be received by an undertaking. So, in the case of those entities falling under Annex A, for their full-time employees, they would be entitled to a supplement calculated on the basis of a 5-day salary up to €800 per month. If I had to compare this to companies which were less critically hit, in such case, in the case of Malta-based companies, they will be subsidized for 1 day's salary, which is based on the €800. So that will be equivalent to 160 per month. In the case of Go Enterprises, that is increased to 2 days' salary, which is equivalent to €320 per month. There we're speaking about full-time employees. If we had to move on to part-time employees, in the case of those that are considered to be engaged in companies which are critically hit, the amount of supplement will be of €500 per month. That compared to those undertakings that are considered to operate in the less critically hit sector. In the case of Maltese-based enterprises, it will be equivalent to 1 day's salary calculated on the €500 per month, so it will be equivalent to €100 per month per employee. In the case of Gozo-based enterprises, it is increased by a further day, so it amounts to €200 per month. Self-employed persons who employ staff will then have an extra day covered by this wage supplement. So basically, that is the difference as to why companies fall in one of the lists rather than the other. Moving on to the guidelines and conditions, there are quite a few over here. So one thing which I feel Malta Enterprise has been repeating quite often is that the supplement must be forwarded in full to the employee. So if I have a circumstance where my employee used to receive €1,000 per month, however, today we are working on a 3-day week, so my employee should be entitled to €600. If I apply for the €800 and get that grant from Malta Enterprise, I am obliged to forward the full €800 to my employee. Secondly, is that there must be communication with the employee on this wage supplement, and also, if possibly, it might be helpful if this is included on the employee's payslip, showing it as a COVID supplement. When it comes to social security contributions from the part of Malta Enterprise, what is going to happen is that Malta Enterprise will retain the share of the employee's social security contribution. So if we're speaking about a wage supplement of €800, Malta Enterprise will withhold 10% of that €800 and will forward the net, this €720, to the employer, who should then pass them all in full to the employee. The wage supplement should not be considered as income in the hands of the employer, and also, as we shall see in another slide, it should not be considered, therefore, either taxable in the hands of the employer and neither tax deductible. So it's practically neutral. Situations we have been facing where companies have more than one, in one entity, more than one distinct activity. And if I have a company which has more than one PE, what should happen in that case, etc. The guidelines Malta Enterprise have is that since the application form is drafted on a PE number basis, then for every PE number that an entity has, a separate application form should be filed. Also, in the case where I have a company which has more than one activity, and these activities are distinct from each other, then an application form should also be filed for every activity. We had also cases where companies, a group of companies has a centralized payroll function. In that case, an application form should also be submitted for every separate entity, and in the application form, detail must be given and evidence should be provided on how the employees of the enterprise are allocated to the different entities. Another important point is that under the scheme, the employer's communication with their employees is critical. So the wage supplement covers that employment of a person which constitutes its main sources of income. So we've had questions where companies ask us, I have a part-timer, can I apply for the part-timer? One must need to see whether the part-time income for that part-timer is indeed his main source of income. It might be that this person has a full-time employment elsewhere where his employer will be applying for the wage supplement on that income. So one needs to confirm with the employee that the income from the employment is indeed the main source of income. Also, employees who are in receipt of a state pension cannot be covered under this scheme, as well as those employees who are maybe availing of other benefits, other measures through the COVID. For instance, if you have persons at home who have stopped working to take care of their family, their children, and are availing of the parent benefit, or you have vulnerable people who are now taking benefit from the medical benefit scheme, in those cases, the employer cannot apply for the wage supplement on those employees. So it is really crucial that the employer communicates with his employees accordingly. Lastly, naturally, Malta Enterprise has the discretion of requesting for further information from an enterprise when vetting the application form, and also the corporation has the right to publish the names of its beneficiaries. It was also communicated that Malta Enterprise may carry out spot checks directly with the employees in order to confirm that such persons were indeed in receipt of the wage supplement from their employers. So that is all from the guidelines and conditions that we are aware of by Malta Enterprise. When we move on to the payroll implications, Some good news is that there shouldn't be any drastic changes in the payroll software of a company. So if we had to move on to the FSS test, how will it work in the circumstances? This wage supplement is considered to be similar to the basic wage of an entity. So it has to be added to the employee's other income and then taxed at in line with the normal FSS rule, so at the progressive tax rates. The employer should record the gross amount of the wage supplement. So Malta Enterprise will indeed be retaining the 10% Social Security contributions. However, in the payroll program, the full gross amount, the €800, should be recorded. And as I mentioned before, the wage supplement should not be considered as income for the employer, and it's neither therefore deductible or taxable. Social Security contributions as we explained, Malta Enterprise will be retaining the employee's share of Social Security contributions. However, the employer should calculate his share on the wage supplement. When it comes to see what is the amount of total security contributions that the employer must forward and pay to the IRD, one then has to remove the amount that would have been retained by Malta Enterprise. As regards maternity fund contributions, given that the wage subsidy is similar to the basic wage of the employee, then the maternity fund contributions should be calculated on that amount. And lastly, we might be seeing some changes in terms of the forms, the payroll forms, such as the FS3 will probably include, you have to include the wage supplement, the FS7 will include the amount that was paid to the employers and that Social Security which is retained by Malta Enterprise and so forth. So there might be some changes in that respect. Then move on to the next slide. So basically that was all with respect to the wage supplement. If you have any questions in respect of the scheme, please include them in the chat panel. Moving on to other measures which are administered by Malta Enterprise and which arose due to this COVID pandemic. The first includes the facilitating of teleworking activities. So probably, as most of you know, companies had to try to shift from the usual way of working, and teleworking has become more popular these days. The scheme is open to both employers and self-employed persons and covers costs incurred in order to have a better technological infrastructure, computer hardware, equipment, etc. The grant is a cash grant, which is equivalent to 45% of the eligible costs. However, this is capped to a €500 per teleworking agreement and capped then to a total of €4,000 per undertaking. It is important that in order for a company to apply under the scheme, there was no teleworking agreement before the 15th of February 2020. Also, the eligible cost should have been incurred between 15 February 2020 till 8 May 2020, where 8 May is the deadline date for the submission of the application form under the scheme. One important point to note is that the scheme is considered, the aid coming out from it is regulated by what is called as de minimis regulations, where de minimis aid is aid of 200,000 over 3 years on a group level. Therefore, one needs to assess what other forms of de minimis aid the group has availed of over the past 3 years to see whether it indeed has any balance to be able to aid from other de minimis schemes. The quarantine leave. So, where the Superintendent of Public Health has advised that certain people need to be on mandatory quarantine, then companies may apply for a quarantine leave benefit, which is equivalent to $250 for every employee. This is also applicable in the case of those persons who either live in the same household or there were also contacts through working in the same workplace. This scheme is applicable to full-time employees. Moving on, a number of other measures, which this time are administered by the Social Security Department, involve various social measures. I won't be going to a lot of detail over here. Mainly it is because the employee, the person as an individual, has to apply for these schemes rather than the employer. So basically there are 4. The unemployment benefit, so those persons who lost their job can apply for this benefit. The parent benefit, for those parents who had to stop from work to take care of their children, can apply for a form of aid. Disability benefit, those persons who have a disability and who work in the private sector and who need to stay at home can also apply for this benefit. And lastly, the most recent one is the medical benefit, where you have vulnerable people who have been ordered to stay at home and not attend to work may avail of this benefit. Lastly, another measure which came into force due to this pandemic relates to the deferral of tax payments, and it is a scheme which is administered by the Inland Revenue Department. So this is merely a postponement of the tax paid because of cash flow disruptions. One important point to note here is that not all taxes are covered. So which are those taxes which are covered with this measure? It includes provisional tax, which is due by the end of this month, payroll taxes, which were due in March, as well as those in April, and VAT due by 15th of March and 15th of April. What taxes are not covered? So company settlement taxes, which relate to 2019, have not been postponed to later dates. Those should be settled by the due dates. Also, the 15% final tax on gross rental income, which is due by the end of this month, should also be settled. The reasoning behind this is that this relates to income which was earned by an undertaking last year, when no one ever dreamt that we will be in this situation. Therefore, one could have put aside the taxes that should have been paid to forward them then by the due date to the Inland Revenue Department. Also, there is a 15% tax on part-time self-employment income. This scheme relates to just the deferral of the tax payment. That is, any documentation that needs to be filed, so payroll forms, VAT returns, income tax returns, etc., should be submitted by the statutory date. Who is eligible to apply under the scheme? We move on to the next slide. So this is eligible for both companies and self-employed persons that can prove a significant downturn in turnover. What does this mean? It means that those companies which have experienced a drop of 25%, at least 25%, in their sales over a 3-month period can apply. The 3-month period is by considering March as being the first or the second month of your workings. So it is for those companies that have experienced this 25% decrease. Companies which are not compliant with the compliance submission, so you have a late VAT return, a late income tax return, would not be able to apply under the scheme. Lastly, I must remind you that the deadline, if you are interested in applying for the scheme, is tomorrow. So any application forms relating to the scheme need to be submitted as soon as possible. That is it from my end. I will now hand over to Angelique to take us to the Malta Development Bank Guarantee Scheme.
Thank you, Maria. I will now go through, as she said, through the COVID Guarantee Scheme. So we'll go immediately to the next slide. So, following the launch of the guarantee scheme by the Malta Development Bank, what we've done from our end is reached out to the local banks in reality to understand better the scheme and how this really will be handled. What the intention of this short session is to share with you some insight that we've obtained, and also to highlight some sort of key pointers as well, some key points with regards to the scheme. So as a starting point, we know that the COVID Guarantee Fund of 250 million allocated by government will enable the banks to leverage this guarantee to a total portfolio volume of 7.8 million. The guarantee fund will be developed, administered and implemented by the Malta Development Bank. However, we know that all this will happen in actual fact through the local commercial banks. Now, just to amplify a little bit further how this works, the mechanics underlying is that this COVID guarantee scheme covers 90% of each facility, capped at 50% of the actual portfolio volume. So if we take an example, if say Bank A provides a loan of say 100 million under the scheme, 90%, that is 90 million, will be secured by the MDB. But if the client defaults, doesn't pay, the bank will only be entitled to claim a maximum of 50% of the total guarantee granted. So in this particular example that I mentioned, Bank A would only be entitled to claim the 50% of the 90% of the 90 million, i.e. 45% of the 90 million. The intention of the exercise here is more to highlight that there is still an element of risk that will be borne by the local commercial banks, and therefore they'll obviously take certain safeguards. Now, if we start trying to answer a couple of points, so who can apply, and the key question sort of, are you eligible? First and foremost, here most local companies should be eligible because the scheme is open to both SMEs and large corporations. SMEs, as mentioned earlier by Daniela, as defined by it's in line with the EU definition. So we're talking about companies that have less than 250 employees, and either a turnover of less than 50 million or a balance sheet total of less than 43 million. I think the critical factor here, though, is not whether you fall perhaps within SME or large enterprise, but the key is that your business must prove, you must be in a position to prove that you are suffering working capital deficiencies as a result of the COVID pandemic. So you need to prove that before the COVID pandemic came into being, you had a consistent and well-managed working capital facility. And that is the critical factor. Another important question is what can be financed through this facility? The eligible costs under the scheme are limited to the costs of a working capital nature. And therefore, one expects, like the salaries, including social security payments, utility bills, rental costs, acquisition of inventory. These are all common working capital costs that are eligible for the scheme. There is, however, an exception in that it also allows the financing of capital expenditure, and therefore anything related to capital creditors. What is important, though, is that you need to prove that those costs have been incurred or contracted pre-COVID. Here also, it is important to note that we understand that any interest on loans that you would have had before coming from previous loans cannot be financed through these facilities. Now, moving on to the next slide, I think you're trying to look at 4 key questions. One is how much funding can be raised, the term of the repayment, the expected cost of this facility, as well as security. What is the expectation from the banks, from companies? So we start with the first one, how much funding can be raised. So first and foremost, an SME is entitled to raise a loan of up to 2 million, whereas a large entity is entitled to a loan of 5 million. In both cases, this limit can be extended. For an SME, this can be extended to 4 million, for a large corporation up to 8 million. But for this to happen, this will need to be approved by the MDB. To seek this sort of approval, the applicants will be required to provide a submission here. Why you need to really prove why you are demanding for more than what is needed. And in addition to the submissions, there is a further capping to this sort of limit in the extension, which is that under this scheme, the loan cannot exceed the higher of 2 times your annual wage bill or 25% of the total turnover based on your financials in 2019. We had, in our discussions with the banks, a point which is still not clear in reality is what is the position of companies forming part of a group. Do the parameters apply to the individual subsidiary or do they apply to the whole group? And in fact, we had quite conflicting answers. Our understanding here, based obviously on our knowledge within the market, is that this may apply, that the limits, that the parameters and limits may apply to the group and not to the individual subsidiary within the group. Other points which we would like to discuss here, sort of to point out, is the term of the repayment. Loans need to be repaid within a period of 4 years. However, again, subject to the right submissions to the MDB, the business, the company may apply for an additional 2 years. So therefore, the maximum term can go up to 6 years. In terms of the moratorium on the interest and also on the capital, on both of them, is for 6 months. This can also be extended to a year. Another consideration, which to be honest is the question that most people ask here, is what is the expected cost for this facility for businesses? Now, mentioning the fact that earlier on, that given that 90% of this facility is guaranteed by government, in reality, this point should reduce the cost of finance. In fact, the initial communication by the MDB, it stated that banks are expected to allow an interest deduction of at least 1 percentage point on their average lending rate. And when we had these discussions with the banks, we also understood that the aim here is to maintain the costs as low as is possible, but at the same time, allowing them to mitigate certain costs relating to the risks they are undertaking. In terms of charges, they are also considering waiving certain costs and fees, such as commitment fees and the like. What about the security? Would commercial banks be entitled to ask for additional security? In the context of what I explained before in the beginning, in that in the case of a default, 45% really and truly could be claimed for government, then with that in mind, banks may seek, yes, additional collateral to mitigate the risk of the unsecured element. Now, based on the discussions also we had with the banks, we understand that the extendable security sought by banks may not exceed 20% of the bank overall portfolio volume. Moving on to the next slide. So, the question is, how shall I proceed with applying for funding in the CGS? In terms of the CGS, in reality, it will follow the same relationships you have with the existing bank. So you will go through your current relationship manager. It will follow through that point. But I think a key important point here is that the challenges are varied, and in reality they're very significant at this point in time. So due and careful consideration must be taken before increasing that. The facilities outlined, in reality, all they are doing is funding losses that will eventually need to be repaid from future profits. So, our advice here is to, in a way, help you protect the future of your business. But at the same time, if you know that you really need to go down the route of extending your debt, then there are 2 key points that we advise that you undertake. First and foremost is to model your short-term cash flows, necessary, so that you understand exactly what amount of funds do you need. If need be, you go on a weekly basis, you project your cash flows on a weekly basis to cover the full period of the stress. Doing that is something which from our experience we are seeing. The second point, however, is also not to stop at looking at the short term, but also moving to extending your cash flow projections to the whole term of the facility, so that you are in a position to assess the ability of your business to service that additional debt that you're undertaking over and above existing facilities that you may already have in your business. There is, in reality, at this point, there is a risk that to try and firefight the current situation, you end up in a position that you will not be able to service the debt that you have in place, the existing and the additional debt that is being undertaken. Also, at this point, the assumptions underlying the projection should be clearly articulated to help the bank understand, and also to clearly highlight what are the underlying drivers of the business, looking at your historical results, looking at your stabilized position in the previous years, and thinking what would you be able to maintain moving forward, and projecting that to the best of your abilities. The quality, naturally, the quality of the submission will impact the efficiency of the response from the banks, which we expect them to be inundated for this particular facility. I now hand over to Andrew, who will be taking us through the training schemes.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Angelique. So training schemes. I think maybe what we've learned over these past 4 or 5 weeks, maybe is it's clear that there has been some downtime, and as well there has been some sort of disruption in the way that we usually operate. So why not use that downtime to either look at possibly upskilling your employees, or alternatively encouraging them to upskill themselves, or even, for the sake of the matter, looking at possibly upskilling yourself. Prior to this outbreak, what businesses have been telling us is that one of their biggest concerns that they have is the availability of skills within their organizations, whether it's digital skills, data, human, and soft skills. So obviously these schemes, that I'll be taking you through, I think are important, that both from a organization point of view, we utilize these schemes that are available for us, as well as encourage our employees to utilize the specific schemes that are there specifically for the individuals. So starting with the first one is the Skills Development Scheme. So this is a scheme which is managed by the Malta Enterprise. Okay, basically, in a nutshell, this scheme focuses on supporting businesses who look into developing and upskilling their current workforce. Okay, so when it comes to what type of training is eligible, so I mean, practically you could say that if you do provide those participants with the skills and knowledge that enhances their potential growth and development, these are areas which this scheme will support the entity. It's important here to note that training which is mandatory by law, unfortunately, is not supported. So, for example, if you're looking at the catering industry, we know that one who needs a food handling license, that training, unfortunately, wouldn't be supported. If we have to move on to the next slide, we can see what type of costs are eligible to entities. So there we have a list which includes consultancy costs for the development of a training program. So if you do look at for third-party support in the development of a training program, that cost can be funded. So the wage costs of trainees, which obviously cover the direct contact hours of the trainee, together as well with the wage costs of the trainer. So if the particular training is held during normal office hours, that wage cost is covered. Obviously, they do take into consideration and base it on the minimum wage rate, which is at around roughly €4.90 per hour. Also, another note to mention there is that if there are some training programs which require you sending your employees overseas to training, so there again, air travel expenses incurred is part of the eligible cost, as well as rental of training rooms. But obviously, as we know that a lot of the training, majority of training has been pushed online and is available there. When it comes to what percentage, let's say, of aid I would receive, there we have it would depend on the size, of the undertaking. So it's 70% for small businesses, 60% for medium, and 50% for large. If we have to move on to the next slide, we see what type of the form of aid that entities would receive. So in principle, the aid is granted in the form of a tax credit, though the Malta enterprise may consider and approve that the aid received is awarded in the form of a cash grant, though these would be needed to be related to any of these following activities. So within the manufacturing, repair and overhaul, and software development there. So in these particular cases, the Malta enterprise may consider awarding the entity a cash grant as opposed to a tax credit. The next is what type of training is eligible, so in order for a business to be considered for this incentive, they should be engaged in one or more of the following activities. So just to mention a few there, so just manufacturing, industry, repair, overhaul and maintenance, logistics, R&D, and so on and so forth. As we mentioned in the beginning, this webinar will be recorded, and if you do have any other questions pertaining to what can be qualified, we can bring that up at a later stage. The next, always sticking to what is available by the Malta enterprise, is the Gets Qualified scheme. So the scheme, some of us might have heard about it or possibly even utilize the scheme. So this is a scheme which supports personal development of individuals. So as opposed to the skills development scheme, this particular scheme is available to the individual. The incentive is applicable for individuals following a course which leads them to a certification. And basically here on the Malta Enterprise website, there is a list of what courses are applicable. These in principle are all those courses which are pegged at a level 5 on the upwards, including industry certifications, such as if we're looking at project management, there's Prince 2, there are Microsoft certifications specifically for IT. So all these type of certifications are eligible under the scheme. Once you are successful from a particular program, the aid there, that is that you would receive 70% of the total fees paid in the form of tax credits. Now, just a note on this is that the amount of refund given cannot be higher than the amount of actual tax paid by the individual for a particular year. So this could mean that the refund could be spread over a number of years, possibly. moving on to Jobs Plus now, okay? So this next scheme is the IIS, so Investing in Skills scheme. Previous to the scheme, they had utilized the training aid framework scheme, which here again supports businesses. Okay, so the scheme was launched primarily to promote training for persons actively participating in the Maltese labour market. Okay, in this regard, there was a budget allocated of 5 million, which is to be utilized up until the 30th of June 2023. Okay, with regards to who is eligible here, really and truly, it covers all employers having an economic activity, irrespective of their legal form. So NGOs, self-employed persons can all benefit from this particular scheme. If we had to move on to the next slide, so what type of aid is given? So this particular scheme is granted in the form of a cash refund, okay? And the following, as you can see in the table, there are what training costs and wage costs can be reimbursed. So there you can see two sections, so non-accredited training and accredited training. Okay, so what do those mean? So let's start off with the accredited training. So there we have a note there. In the eyes of Jobs Class, accredited training means that any course which is pegged between a level 1 to 5 on the Malta Qualifications Framework. So there, the reimbursement rate per trainee would be of 25 euros per trainee. Okay, for all of the contact hours that particular course has. In addition to that rate per hour, should the training be held between office hours, one would be entitled as well to that €4.90 per hour per trainee as well. When it comes to the non-accredited training, so there what we mean is that either a tailor-made, let's say, soft skills training program, which is not recognized on the Malta Qualifications Framework. So there, the course is capped. So more of the reimbursement is capped at a total of 25 hours. So anything over those number of hours, one would not be entitled to that 25 euros per hour. When it comes to the amount of aid intensity, again, similar to the skills development scheme, this would depend on the size of the entity. 70% for small and micro, medium were at 60%, and 50% for large entities. Just a note on this is that from experience, what we've been told is that let's say a subsidiary of a company who could be considered as a small company due to the number of employees that they have apply for through the scheme. Should that subsidiary form part of a larger entity, they would always obviously take into consideration that they form part of that larger entity. In fact, it's a case that we had with a particular client where them specifically were considered as a small entity, though they formed part of a larger entity. Therefore, they were reimbursed the 50%. Last but not least is another scheme which is controlled by Jobs Plus, which is the training pay scheme. So this scheme again focuses on the individual now. Okay, where basically it forms part of the ESF 01001 training for employment project, which aims to assist individuals in developing or improving their skills. It's open to all participants between the age of 16 to 64, okay? And as well, can apply for any course subject to them not being offered by Jobs Plus themselves, offered by a licensed training institution. The training must be again pegged between level 1 to level 5, and the minimum cost for training must be at least €100. The form of aid given here again is a cash cost, okay, and the grant will be equivalent to 75% of the direct training costs, okay, but not exceeding at a maximum of €1,000. So to give you an example, so if a particular course costs 1,500, let's say, you would be reimbursed, the individual, sorry, would be reimbursed for 75% of €1,000 and not of that 1,500. As well, just a note here is that the maximum allowable grant for any applicant is one calendar year is capped to €1,000. So what maybe I didn't mention on the Get Qualified scheme here is that you can apply for more than one course at a time and utilize the Get Qualified scheme there. From my end, I believe that's about it. I think at this point,
yes, I'll take over from here. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, so thank you to everyone for their contributions. As we indicated earlier, should you have any questions to put to the speakers, you can do so by sort of putting down your question. In the meantime, there are a number of questions that have come through. I'd maybe like to start off with Daniela. There was done a particular question with regards to the ERDF consultancy scheme.
Yes.
Clarifying a bit the sort of how this €4,000 is refunded, whether it's the full amount, what if the cost of the consultancy is larger? Maybe explain a bit in better detail how this works.
Okay, so in terms of the consultancy grant scheme, given that it's a lump sum grant, irrespective of the study that is undertaken and the size of the study, it is the €4,000 you will receive. So it won't be more, it won't be less. So it's a grant, it's a non-repayable grant. So one will receive the. Thank you for the slide card. So basically, here it's a grant that you will receive once it is approved. So you will pay for the consultancy services, and then you will receive a reimbursement of the €4,000.
Yes.
On this, just to keep in mind something that I mentioned earlier. The scheme is a de minimis scheme, okay? So if anyone is applying for other aid that falls under the de minimis thresholds, they would also need to consider what aid is being received once applying for this scheme.
Okay, thank you, Daniela. There were quite a few questions that came in for David and Maria. So starting off with first question, what is the criteria for part-time employees to receive the wage supplement? David or Maria?
Hi, Mish. Thank you for that. Before answering that question, a bit hot off the press, and we are living a bit in these times as well. I've just been emailed from one of my clients who has actually received some email feedback from Malta Enterprise following an application made for the COVID wage supplement. It is a very lengthy email. I must say this is not merely an acknowledgement. So the first email that you receive once you have actually filed the application, but it is actually the email whereby in this particular case the application for the aid has been approved. Sorry, so not exactly what the question was about, but I thought it was really interesting to share with whoever is on this webinar that that as promised, even last Thursday I was on a webinar with Malta Enterprise. They are indeed speeding up the process to review these applications, and they promised as well last week that during the course of this week enterprises will start receiving feedback from them, and indeed that is true. The email, as I was saying, is quite a lengthy email. It includes the information on the amount of aid that is being given. In this case, it was aid given to the highly critical sector business. The aid is for a bit more than a month, so it covers the period 17th March till the 24th April. In this case, so it is actually more than the 800 euros, because obviously I'm assuming this prorated. I didn't have time to look into it in too much detail. The email also includes quite a list of terms and conditions. Presumably, these are being repeated from those that were already in the website of the of Malta Enterprise. What it includes as well, which I think is really good, is a request to react to the email. So there are three ways you can react. There are three links, three buttons. Either you are accepting the email, or you are only partially accepting the email, or you are disagreeing with the contents of the email. And that presumably is so that if you only partially accept or if you disagree, then Malta Enterprise would be notified about that, and there will be possibly a better look at your application. Maybe they will contact the business in question, asking more questions to understand better the situation and why the particular business is not accepting the amount of aid being provided. So I think this is good news. The expectation as well was, as Maria explained, that the aid is not only available to the sectors actually listed in the annexes published by Malta Enterprise, but also those that are not listed, and even the amount of aid might not be exactly as identified in the list published. Obviously, where the sector is one that has been identified up front, then as to be expected, and there's also Malta Enterprise actually said themselves, the review process, the vetting process of the application is much smoother, because now it has already to a large extent been pre-approved in terms of a sector. Where you come from a sector that has not been pre-approved, then the expectation is that the vetting process is likely to take a bit longer than what we have seen, at least for the one that has just come into my mailbox. So some good news to share there. So watch your email inboxes if you have applied for this aid. Just to go to the question, Michelle, so what is the criteria for part-time employees to receive the wage supplement? The criteria, I understand, is relatively simple. It is basically based on information already held by government authorities. In this case, it is information held by Jobs Plus. Okay, so when you are engaging an employee, you need to determine whether the employee is being employed on a full-time basis or a part-time basis, and that classification largely is what Malta Enterprise are going to be basing itself on in terms of granting the aid. I think this shows as well the importance of keeping the data at Jobs Plus as updated as possible. Okay, so anyone who has not been keeping up the data in the right way, obviously now might be finding it a bit of a problem in terms of even ensuring the right aid is actually provided. But Malta Enterprise have made it extremely clear that their first point of reference, or whatever you are applying for, the data is going to be vetted by them against the data held at Jobs Plus. So ideally you have the same category over there.
Okay. Thank you, David. There was a follow-up question then on the teleworking scheme, whether it applies sort of per PE number, or is it sort of per entity in terms of the minimis sort of regulation? Maria, maybe you'd care to.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. So the teleworking scheme is considered per entity rather than per PE number. So the capping of 4,000 euros is on an entity basis. When it comes to the minimis, however, one needs to see what de minimis aid it has availed of in the context of the whole group of companies. Another question, if I can continue, which also seems to relate to the teleworking scheme, is where a company may have had an employee who spent a number of hours setting up teleworking system for all the employees in the firm, whether the extra expense for working more hours can be covered. The only eligible expenses in the case of the teleworking scheme include the purchasing or leasing of computer hardware and then the communication solutions to connect to the place of work, so VPN communications, etc. In such case, employee wage costs are not considered eligible under the scheme. From the schemes we have described, it is only the wage supplement scheme that provides for aid on salary costs. However, the intention over there is to assist those undertakings that have suffered, and therefore the payroll cost is quite a burden because either their outlets are closed or they have experienced a significant drop in their turnover.
What about part-time employees, students? How are they being?
So for part-time employee students, possibly the part-time employment will constitute their main source of income. So with that, they should be able to apply their employer should be able to apply for the scheme on their part-time employment, given that they have no other job which might constitute their main income.
Michelle, if I can add a bit to that, there is nothing in the schemes that actually exclude students merely because they are students. Okay, so I think that is the important point. On the previous point, on the teleworking scheme, etc. Let's not forget one thing: this is aid being given by government, and therefore, in principle, it qualifies as state aid. So for it to be legal state aid, so not to infringe EU rules, it must either be given in the context or within the structures already existing in the European Union. So what is allowed state aid already under the rules of the European Union. Or else, like happened, for example, in the wage supplement, that is being provided in terms of special criteria, a special dispensation, if you want, that the EU has actually passed in view of the pandemic, and that is, it did not provide it only to Malta, but it provided it also to other EU territories. So let's not. So even in terms of how the minimus works, etc. Really and truly, we're not looking at new rules here. We're looking at the rules already existing in this particular respect.
Okay, thank you. There was then another question. Companies with employees who will be claiming parent benefits, should they terminate the employment or retain them on unpaid leave? Does the company need the IER approval? Sort of what are your views on that?
Okay, not a clear answer in my mind, and also in Maria, because we were discussing it whilst Angelique was doing her part as well. Let me tell you, I mean, I can answer from a logical perspective. The aid that is being given primarily has an intention of retaining employees on the employee book. Okay, so the aim, the target, if you look at even the way they have been announced, okay, even at the rules that they are bound with, etc. The idea is that businesses, although they are suffering, retain their employees on their books, okay, despite being able to only provide them with a lower wage and so on and so forth, but ideally they do not go under the employment benefit and therefore are without a job, okay? So the idea is to go in that direction. So in my mind, the answer to this question is no. There is no need in my mind to actually stop the employment of these employees. Our expectation, for example, would be that you would need to ensure that they are not given a wage, and therefore you would do that by, for example, asking them to go on unpaid leave. And only if they are on unpaid leave would the Department of Social Security actually provide that particular benefit. At least for the medical benefit, it is like that. And our expectation would be that in this case it would be something similar. But again, Michelle, as I said before, the number of cases which you are seeing are really not normal, and I think it could be that even in this case one would need to double check on the answer to that one with either the Social Security Department or with the IAR. Okay.
Directors of companies who pay Social Security as self-employed, this postponement, does this apply to them as well?
Sorry, Maria. Yes, because there was another point that I think I wanted to emphasize here as well. So, sorry, Maria, to interrupt. I think the answer should be yes. There is also one additional point here. Okay, so in respect of employers who are receiving the wage supplement for Malta Enterprise, okay, which is of 800, and out of which the employee's share of Social Security will be withheld by Malta Enterprise. As Maria rightly said, the employer must still pay the employer's share and the maternity leave fund contribution for that particular salary. Okay, now that would typically be paid with the FS5 being submitted in the month after, okay? But if that particular enterprise has filed the applicable form with the revenue to defer that payment, then the employer's share of that Social Security contribution and the maternity leave fund contribution for that particular month is also deferred. So it falls under the scheme basically to defer taxes in the same way as the Social Security for directors. Obviously, you have to be a director of an entity typically that would be critically hit. Okay, so there are the rules that the CFR has actually set out. So there are the rules over there. One needs to read them. One needs to qualify under that rule, and also one needs, as Maria said, to apply for that deferment by the deadline, which was tomorrow.
Okay. Maria, before you spoke about the teleworking, there is a follow-up question. So if the company engages outside consultants to set up the VPN connections, etc., can this expense be applied for? Is this something that, in terms of the detail, you're able to answer directly on this specific?
The guidelines mention, as I already explained, purchasing of computer hardware and communication solutions to connect to the place. So, in my view, if the consultants are engaged to communicate and an invoice will be provided to the undertaking, I would consider trying to qualify on that basis, obviously, depending on amounts, etc. But I would consider it if I have an invoice in hand.
Okay, thank you. This question that's just come in. What is the effect on the wages supplement between a part-timer with predefined hours and a casual worker? That is someone working hours that fluctuate. The casual worker segment seems to be getting overlooked.
No, I don't think, I wouldn't agree that it is being overlooked. Actually, if one looks at the application form, set up by Malta Enterprise. I must say they have done a fantastic job in such a short time, even in terms of the application form itself. When you are indicating the number of employees on which you are requesting the wage supplement, actually you need to divide those employees into 3 categories. There's full-time, part-time, and casual. Already that is indicative in my mind that even in respect of casual workers, you will be given aid. My understanding on that one is that in the case of casual workers, you need to give an indication of the amount of hours that they were working before the pandemic hit, so that then those number of hours will be used as a benchmark for the amount of aid, the amount of wage supplement that Malta Enterprise would be giving in respect of those particular workers. But as I said, because they are not fixed hours, and therefore one would need to actually do a computation and so on and so forth. In this particular case, my expectation is that once an application has been submitted with Malta Enterprise, then there might be a bit of toing and froing between Malta Enterprise and that business to ensure that the proper amount is computed in terms of aid, and this is appropriately paid to the employer for on forwarding to the particular casual worker. We also have had, for example, queries on what is the position for persons who are employed full-time but on reduced hours. I mean, would they qualify as being part-time? Would they qualify as being casual? How are they computed? Again, that is a bit the jury's out on that one. There is some guidance on that in the Malta Enterprise website, but there have also been some statements made in the webinar of Malta Enterprise of last Thursday. So we are still following up on that particular point as well. Again, as I said, a number of situations which are not really clear and which still need to be clarified by the authorities in various respects.
Okay, thank you, David. I see that we've exhausted the questions submitted. So on that note, I'd like, on behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this webinar. And obviously, should you have any follow-up questions, please do reach out to us, and we'll be glad to be able to respond. In the meantime, keep safe, everyone. Bye-bye.